In this tutorial, I will talk about an AwareIM concept called shortcuts, which is mostly used to display values of other business objects and queries. Please make sure that you are familiar with the concept of query in AwareIM and watch the corresponding tutorials before watching this one. The question frequently asked by new AwareIM users is this: I can display values of a business object using a query on this object, but how do I display values of other objects in the same query? Well, first of all, the quote-unquote other object that the query needs to show is not just some random object. If it is shown by the query, it must be somehow related to the main object that the query shows. So there must be a reference attribute to the other object declared in the main object of the query. For more details about reference attributes, please watch the relationships tutorial. Once the reference attribute exists in the main object, it is possible to show it in a query using a technique called shortcuts. Note that the relationship between the objects must be a single one, because if there are multiple instances of the other object related to the main one, then it's not clear values of which instance the query needs to show. Let's look at an example. Here I have a small application from the previous tutorials that manages customers. We have the customer object here that has first name, last name, date of birth, and other attributes. There is also an object called contact node, which represents a record of communication with the customer. Its attributes include the date of the communication, the subject, and details of the communication. Obviously, a communication record reflects communication with a particular customer, and therefore this object has a single reference to the customer that this communication is for. Suppose now that we want our system to show all communication records for all customers that we have. For each communication record, we want to show the date, subject, duration, and the name of the customer with whom the communication was. Let's add this query to the system. So I create a new query. The query will look for the contact node object. I go to the display details of the query and I select subject, date, and duration as attributes to be shown by the query. But how do we show the name of the customer? Customer is a reference attribute, and AwareIM does not offer this attribute in the list of attributes to display. To show the name of the customer in our query, we must define a shortcut. I'll show you how to do this. Let me save the query first. Shortcuts are special attribute types that allow you to refer to a particular attribute in the related object. Shortcuts need to be defined in the main object of the query. So we go to the contact node object and add a new attribute. The type of the attribute will be shortcut. And here we need to define a path to some single reference attribute of the related object. We have only one reference attribute here called customer. So we now need to pick an attribute of the customer object that shortcut will refer to. We pick last name. Note that the shortcut path can be a multi-level one. For example, the customer object has its own single reference to the company object, so our shortcut in the contact node object could refer to the name of the company, for example, like this: customer.company.name. We need another shortcut here to the first name of the customer, so that we can show both first name and last name of the customer in the query. Let's create one. Now I will just change the labels of the shortcuts to be just first name and last name. Now we're ready to continue defining our query. So let's go back to the query, go to the display details, and here we go. We can see the shortcuts in the list of attributes that can be displayed by the query. We select them, and let's also add an operation to edit the form of the communication record object. I will just add this query to the system menu and we're done. So now we put the version under test. And we'll log into the application using the browser. And here we can see our button to run the query. We run it and we can see the communication records with customer names here. We can actually sort by shortcuts here, or we can build the initial sorting criteria directly in the query. Shortcuts can also be placed on a form, and it is actually a great way to see attributes of some related object directly on the form of the parent object. Putting shortcuts on a form is just like putting any other attribute on a form. In fact, a where I am should have automatically added both shortcuts to the form of the contact node. So if we click on the edit button here, we should see them on the form. And here they are. Note, you can only display shortcuts as read-only on a form. You cannot change these values. However, we can make shortcuts editable in a query if we enable inline editing for the query and make the shortcut editable. In this case, a whereIm will automatically generate a drop-down, and we can pick a value from the drop-down. Let's do it. Let's go back to the query, enable inline editing, and make last name shortcut editable. Let's see what happens. When we go back to the browser and run our query, and then we try to edit the last name, we can see that whereIm generates a drop-down with the last names of all customers that we have, and we can pick the one that we want. It doesn't make sense to change the customer of the communication record, but consider this example. Let's say you have a purchase order that consists of line items, and each line item refers to a product. You enter line items in line within a reference table inside an order. When you specify the details of a particular line item, you want to enter quantity and then pick a product from the list of available products. To achieve this, you would need to define a shortcut to the product name inside the line item object. Enable inline editing for the line items attribute inside the order and make the shortcut to the product editable, along with quantity, of course. Let me quickly show this to you. So let's create our objects first, starting with a product object, which will have just an attribute name. Then line item object, which will have quantity, and a reference to the product. And then we'll have purchase order, with some order number, and multiple line items. Okay, now the line items attribute in the purchase order will have inline editing enabled, and we will show quantity and it will be editable. But here we cannot select product, and that's where we need a shortcut. So we go to the line item object and add a shortcut to the product name. The label will be called product. Now when we go back to the purchase order, to the line items attribute, we can now see the shortcut here, and we'll make it editable as well. We will also remove this operation from here. Oh yes, and we need to add an operation to create a new item. And the final thing, we need to go to the product reference attribute and make sure that it's displayed as a drop-down, and fetched all records at once is ticked. We do it because the shortcut will inherit these options when it is displayed as part of inline editing. So let me add this operation to our menu. And we're done. Let's see how this works. So we go back to our application, and I have already populated the system with 3 products. We can click New Order now, enter the order number, and then click New to add a new line item. And here we can pick the product inline using Editable shortcut. And then create another one. Pick another product. So as you can see, Editable shortcuts are a great way to add data during inline editing.